Environmentalism is actually the most powerful ideology in the West today.
So you don't believe in this potential catastrophe?
No, the catastrophizing is basically propaganda. It's a tool to stop debate. They said climate change will be second only to a global nuclear war. There is nothing that remotely justifies such a claim.
If this progression continues and advances and we head towards net zero, who wins?
Oh, that's very easy to answer. China. China and Russia. They're the big winners from the West deciding to bring itself to its knees. Net zero is Vladimir Putin's best ally.
Good evening. Welcome to NTD's Fresh Look America. I'm Paul Greaney. We're joined by Rupert Darwall. He's a senior fellow with the RealClearFoundation. He's also the author of Tyranny and The Age of Global Warming, a History. Rupert, thank you.
My pleasure, Paul.
Rupert, we see this strange dynamic playing out in the United States at the moment where President Biden is asking other countries, OPEC Plus for example, to increase their oil output, but at the same time hampering and discouraging oil production and oil and gas production here in the United States. Can you explain what's happening here?
Yeah, what you're seeing is a completely insane energy policy playing out, and that's driven by green ideology and the administration's goal of achieving net zero emissions by 2050. To achieve that, you basically have to decarbonize the American economy, which is not just a colossal undertaking, it's an impossible one to achieve. And to do that, you have to drive up prices. You have to drive them up sky high. And what's happening is you're getting a lot of voter blowback from high gasoline prices. So the administration is begging everyone, apart from American oil and gas producers, to pump more oil, so to bring down the price temporarily, that is to say.
In the last administration, President Trump pursued oil and gas production, pursued energy independence. Why is it globally we tend to see more progressive or liberal political parties being very anti-fossil fuels, whereas more conservative ones tend to be pro-fossil fuels?
I would say that distinction is really only in the US, predominantly in the US. In Europe, for example, virtually all political parties, there might be an exception with the new Italian government, which I haven't studied, but generally speaking, all mainstream European parties are signed up to net zero, so they all believe in this stuff, and it's a function of green ideology. Environmentalism is actually the most powerful ideology in the West today. It is essentially conquered. It is triumphant in the West. And people talk about neoliberalism. You know, we live in, it's absolute rubbish. I mean, it's actually environmentalism which is the most powerful ideology in the West.
Can you explain that?
Can I explain it? I think it's partly because of the death of socialism as a viable alternative to capitalism and free markets, and people want to believe, and there's something that within people, there's an ideological need, if you like, to believe that the present is jeopardizing the future, and therefore the present should be sacrificed for the sake of some better future, a purer, cleaner, greener future. And you had that kind of thinking, a similar ideological concept with communism, of course, where the present was going to be sacrificed for a communist future. Today we're talking about sacrificing the present for a clean future where the planet is saved from some kind of imaginary catastrophe.
So you don't believe in this potential catastrophe?
No, the catastrophizing is basically propaganda. It's a tool to stop debate, because what it means is if you're questioning what we're trying to do, you're therefore you're quite okay with it's a form of moral blackmail. You're okay with a planetary catastrophe that's going to wipe out billions of people.
What led you to take this stance on the science?
Well, the science actually doesn't say the mainstream science does not say there's going to be a catastrophe. I'll give you an example. I can give you two examples. The first one is you often hear about climate tipping points, and these tipping points will lead to some kind of terrible catastrophe. And one of those tipping points is the melting of the Greenland ice sheet. If you look at the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessment report, what they talked about was with a sustained warming, of quite a high sustained warming, it would be multiple millennia, right, before the Greenland ice sheet has completely and irrecoverably melted. So we're talking about timescales. They're sort of geological timescales. You know, when people who look at rocks, they measure time in a completely different way from what we do in terms of the measurement of time in a human society. So the catastrophizing is what they have to do is telescope the timescales enormously, so that, you know, there might be a catastrophe at the end of the century or something like that. So the catastrophizing is basically an invented thing. To give you another example, the same IPCC report, the Working Group 1 report on the science, it's about 4,000 pages long. 3,000 or 4,000 pages long. From memory, there are 5 mentions of catastrophe or catastrophic scenarios, and one of those is one of those was referring to a study on, quote, the catastrophic flooding of the Atacama Desert. I can't remember which year that was, but was that a catastrophe? Was that something that hit the headlines?
Why is it then that, at least in the media and in politics and leadership, tells us that the overwhelming majority of scientists say there's a catastrophe, says that man-made global warming is something we need to be seriously concerned and worried about?
Well, it's moral blackmail. It's really as simple as that. If you take away the catastrophism, you would not be completely reorganizing society around the unachievable goal of net zero emissions in 3 decades. So that can't, there are lots of reasons why that's not going to happen, and it can't happen if we want to maintain anything like our standard of living and our way of life. But to persuade people to go down that road, you have to tell them there's something, you know, worse than. I mean, when all this started, it was in 1988, was the first big climate conference, which was in Toronto. And then they said climate change will be second only to a global nuclear war. So we've had, well, how many years since 1988, right? Over 3 decades. So can anyone really, hand on heart, say we've seen anything approaching a global nuclear war in terms of extreme weather? Because climate change is manifested in extreme weather, okay? There is nothing that remotely justifies such a claim.
A global nuclear war, it sounds a little sensationalist, that's for sure. You mentioned something in your previous answer that perhaps this is just a way to reorganize the society, to change the society in some way. Can you explain that?
Well, I can point you to the IPCC's 1.5 degree special report that was produced after the Paris conference in 2015. And that report said net zero offers the opportunity for societal transformation. I'm not saying that. That's what the so-called scientists wrote in that report. And it's really important to understand that 1.5 degree special report was an ideological document. I mean, talking about this is, when people think about scientists, they're thinking it's pure, objective, and so forth. This is shot through with ideology. So the goal of creating the opportunity for societal transformation is an ideological project. So one has to, in my view, you have to understand this in ideological terms.